there are huge opportunities. Think about the fact that in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters, danger and opportunity. John D. Rockefeller, famous quote was, "I always try to turn every disaster into an opportunity." And probably the most famous of all is Winston Churchill, who is believed to have said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Well, I think that we should listen to these advice and move accordingly. So what we'd like to do, we can turn the slide, please. If we could move to thinking about what are the implications? What should we do in time of crisis? Well, there are three things. We have to cope and survive the crisis, but at the same time, we have to identify and capture opportunities that the crisis offers, and ideally, anticipate and prepare for the next crisis. So if we turn to the next page, please, we can see that our objective here, what we're trying to do in our session, is primarily to identify what are some of the opportunities that we can create and capture during a crisis. Some of those I'm going to discuss with you 10 guidelines, and some of them you'll see are also relevant to the current crisis and hopefully will help us in anticipating a future one. The structure will be, I'm going to discuss 10, we'll go each one of them pretty briefly, and after the first 5, we'll try to stop for a few minutes for Q&A, and then we'll have another Q&A at the end of the session. So if we can turn to the first guideline, please. The first one is the most critical of the 10. And this is the required to challenge and ideally change your mental model. The current mental model of many is, well, it's a short-term, big crisis, but we can't wait to go back to the old good days. Well, the old good days are not going to exist anymore. Basically, things cannot go back to normal or to the old normal. Just consider, for example, schools and universities are all now working online. For them to go back to the old model, ignoring the online education is crazy. And the solution will be basically what Morris suggested. You need a hybrid model. You need a hybrid model. Flipped classroom, what Morris described briefly, is becoming increasingly important. It's a trend that existed before, but will intensify because we have to start thinking more creatively. How do we engage students and increase the effectiveness of the online component of the new mix of education? Think about organizations in terms of work for home. You know, the point that Maura made so powerfully. You know, no organization can go back to the old model and ignore work from home. We just finished a few surveys that show that work from home is desired as part of the new reality by a significant number. In some of our studies, 2/3 of the employees. So there is no more the kind of the old reality of the concept of work or workspace, and both have to be changed dramatically. Think about video conferencing. We've all been experiencing video conferencing for everything we do, socially, for business-like, for negotiations, and you cannot just ignore it and go back to the old models. So you have to change the model. And I mentioned before the current crisis in the US, following the George Floyd murder. This is going to have fundamental change on people's perceptions. McKinsey has been conducting continuous studies on consumer sentiments during the crisis. And one of the major implications that they found, and supported by a number of other surveys, is that most consumers, when they respond to this and ask, what are the implications? They said, well, it's time for us to reflect, time for us to think. Why are we doing certain things? And you saw the time of reflection actually in some of the surveys that Morris suggested, the CFO surveys and some of the others. And I think that's what will lead to, in the second crisis kind of mode, will lead people to rethink the whole question of social justice, question of racism, question of what are we doing about this. So I think you'll see fundamental changes, not only that every individual has to go through, but also in terms of society. We can move to the next item, please. So in addition to the absolute importance of challenging and changing the mental models we have, the second kind of opportunity we have is to speed up the digital transformation and the creation of a digital infrastructure. Everyone was thrown into the reality that we have to rely on digital activities, digital exchange, whether it was the universities, whether it was retailers that moving to e-commerce activities, whether it is cultural institutions, art museums, and other cultural institutions, that all of them were forced to close. And the only way in which they can still engage their audiences, or ideally even build new one, is through online engagement. Many of them were not prepared. They didn't have the right digital infrastructure. This will speed up significantly the move toward digital transformation and the creation of needed digital infrastructure that will be able to accommodate also some of the advances in areas such as augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, and others. We can turn to the next slide, please. The third area that I would like to suggest as having huge opportunities is the identification of new business opportunities that's created by the crisis. Seeing as example, the work of Carlo Ratti. He's a designer who designed, using open source primarily, intensive care pod within a shipping container for hospitals. He called it Cura. And it's a design that for emergency COVID-19 hospitals to solve the crisis of not having enough hospital beds. Or think about Zoom, the one that we're using all the time, and they're creating backgrounds for people so you can have a kind of more exciting background when you're in a Zoom call. Or a number of companies that are focusing now on creating these type of Zoom background. Huge opportunities in terms of, in many areas, and some of them the areas that more discussed in terms of the areas of growth that we're seeing, but we have to think about this. So what are the new opportunities that this crisis suggests to us? We move to the fourth area. It's a critical one. The fourth area, if we can move, thank you, is to re-examine the talent strategy and adopt open innovation. I don't know how familiar you are with open innovation, but it's probably one of the major breakthroughs in strategy in the last decade or so. To give you an idea for the power of this, think about, and this is really the focus of this, or the origin of this goes back to the whole idea of the wisdom of the crowd. I'll give you some statistics to realize why it's so critical. If you think that in your organization you have all the talent, the best talent to solve your problem, you're probably wrong. There is never, no company that can basically get all the needed talent to solve your problems. There is a huge amount of talent around the world. If you think about areas such as software development, the difference between a top coder and an average one is about 10x, and this is pretty well documented. Now, the 10x programmers are not likely to go and work for your company. If they're going to work for a company, they'll try to work for NASA, Google, some of the other exciting companies that are changing the world, or they would like to be independent. And as independent, they either respond to competitions to solve specific problems, or they can become part of an aggregate, companies like Top Coder that has over 1 million top coders as members of their network. And when a company, and some of the largest company around in many fields like Eli Lilly or others, have a problem that they cannot solve internally, they turn to open innovation. And the findings are that most of the problems that those organizations like Top Coder or Innocentive and others get, they can solve about 40% of these problems. And the major finding is that in most cases, the people who solve the problems are not people from the discipline that the problem is from. So if Eli Lilly giving them a medical problem, it is not the medical experts who are going to solve the problem. The problem is typically, and the recent example was Merck gave a challenge, and the challenge, a very clinical one, the solution came from 3 computer scientists from MIT. The open innovation area is revolutionizing the whole concept of talent, because it means I don't have only to hire talent, but I have to develop access to talent. To give you a magnitude of this, there was a recent study of about 1,000 cases of open innovation that found out that open innovation is 4x faster and 8x cheaper than having your own people. And part of this is because you're paying, in most cases, only for the output. If you're not familiar with this, go to the website of NASA, and you'll see how NASA relies continuously in solving all of their big problems on open innovation. This is the revolution in talent, that you have to start thinking about, how do I switch from the traditional model that most companies have, hire people, to a much more open context of saying, yeah, I need some people internally, especially for the design or for the integration, but much of what has to be done can be done by open innovation. There is no better time to rethink the talent strategy than during crisis. Any organization, if you look at the talent that you have and ask the question, how appropriate are they for the needs of the 21st century? You'll find out that you probably have a normal curve. And some of the people you have are not equipped to address the challenges of the 21st century. The typical reaction is, yeah, but they're loyal, they've been with me for a while, I can't do anything about them. Well, crisis provides you the opportunity to examine each one of them, ask the question, do they have the potential of improving? If yes, absolutely, keep them and try to develop them. But if they don't, replace them with the people with the right type of skills for the 21st century and start introducing open innovation. Open innovation is now also called open talent, and increasing number of companies are moving in this area. Absolutely critical component, and there's no better time to address the talent challenge than during crisis. Let's turn to the 5th guideline. And here I would like to suggest that you do something that you typically say to do at times of crisis, but what I would like you to do is to seriously think about taking a process of idealized design. Idealized design is a process developed years ago, actually by Russ Akoff, was implemented originally by Bell Lab and other places. And the idea is, as opposed to the traditional planning, which is where are we now and how do we move forward, it's try to identify an ideal design, ideal in the future, flying to the moon. Many times it's called now moonshot. What is really the objective? Where do you want to be 5 to 10 years from now? Once you identify it, then you work backward, and it's called backward planning. You work backward and saying, okay, how do I get there to try to accomplish my ideal? Why is this important? At time of crisis, there is huge temptation for mergers, acquisitions, or acquisition of talent at bargain prices. And it's tempting. You know, if you can buy a competitor, you can buy a new startup at a much reduced price than it was before, it's a huge temptation. But before we do it, because the acquisition can actually impact the future of your company, let's stop, let's go through a process of idealized design and see to what extent the proposed acquisition fit in this new ideal context. To think in terms of pragmatics of how do you go about idealized design, very simple exercise. Identify a time horizon, identify what would you like to be known for 5 or 10 years from now, whatever the time horizon is that you decide. Then create an award and give yourself the award. Say you got that award, whatever the award is, and now create the headline that will appear at your favorite publication, whether it's Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, whatever. What is the title of this award? Well, that's what you're trying to accomplish 3 to 5, 10 years from now. And then try to write a few lines in terms of what is the reason, why did you get the award? Going through this process will help you identify an idealized design. will help you then evaluate various activities, acquisition and others, to make sure that they are consistent with where you want to go to. Let me stop here with the first 5 guidelines and answer any questions you have on this, and then we'll continue with the next 5 guidelines.
So Yoram, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your general question?
Yes, thank you, Professor. I just wanted to ask, as a general framing for the 10 guidelines, are those, in your opinion, predictions of what is going to happen, or are these things that should happen?
It's very difficult to be as prescriptive and say they should happen. They're all trends that we see. You know, they are based on trends, on experience, and there is a lot of evidence behind it. I believe that these guidelines are things that every executive should consider. Many are doing it today, but what specifically, which of them, and how to adjust this depends on your unique situation. So no one can tell you you should do this. The idea is treat them as hypothesis and ask the question, does this relate to me or not? What we've done is I published an article a few weeks ago at Knowledge at Wharton on the topic that identifies those 10. I believe you have a copy of this. And we've had a large number of companies that followed up with this, and we had similar session to yours, to the one we're having now. In most of them, where we asked at the end, identify the participants, identify one of these 10 areas that you would like to experiment with, go do it, and then report back. And we've had now in a number of organizations like the Leader of Design Council at SCI, a number of other companies, we had the experience of individuals participate in the session, actually implementing design experiments and then reporting back, and some fascinating experiences coming out of this. So what I'm suggesting here is, for your consideration, these are 10 areas. I would say the one that you must do is challenge your current mental model. But other than this, everything else is kind of explore this and say, does it fit for me, my condition, my situation? And the other one that I would say you should do is the 10th one, the 10th item, which will be experimentation, which we'll get to.
Thank you. Lior?
Thank you. I would like to ask the guidelines regarding creating and discovering opportunities. But as I believe it was Cambridge that said that sometimes we realize an opportunity had occurred only in hindsight. So other than the second one regarding digitalization, that's something that companies needed to do in order to survive, especially the one for food and beverage and turning to e-commerce and retailing. So the other ones are, I'm trying to ask what happens when the managers are basically working on surviving. How can they try to discover opportunity during a crisis when all they're trying to do is to survive, basically?
Well, the idea is, what does survival mean? I'll give you an example from a good example and a bad example. In art museums have been really hurt in the life crisis. And many of them had to close, and which meant that the revenue in terms of membership, sales in the store, donations and other, all have been going down. Some museums, unfortunately, took the view that we have to do 2 things. We have to survive or service. That's an actual quote from a director of a museum. And they said that we cannot afford doing the service, so we're focusing only on survival. And they basically shut down. They had almost no communication with their audiences. And in contrast to this, museums such as the Getty, the Barnes Foundation, Philadelphia, the Met in New York, even the University Museum in Philadelphia, they took a very active role of how do we engage our audiences digitally. The Getty, for example, created a competition where they asked people to select a picture or art piece from the Getty and try to recreate it at home and then share it with the audiences. The Barnes have basically a daily take. So every day you get one of the curators or educators provide education to content to their members. Well, the Barnes doubled their audiences, kind of almost weekly. They increased their donations, and they're basically improving significantly the sales of their activities. So what's happening here is you have to survive, but you cannot ignore the critical thing, which is how do you continue to engage your key stakeholders? And if you will not do it, you will not survive later on. There's actually pretty good research over historical series of crises that companies that continue to engage their audiences, especially their customers during time of crisis, are doing significantly better after the crisis than companies that stop advertising and stop engaging their audiences. So to me, the engagement of your audiences, which is we'll come to in a minute, is absolutely an essential part of survival, and that's where the opportunities will be. And I'm suggesting here like 10 areas, think about them and try to identify what are the ones that fits best your specific situation and combine it with your survival activities.
Okay, thank you. I think we can move on and then stop for a few more questions.
So let's move to the sixth guideline. And the sixth guideline is a switch from the traditional shareholder focus, which is let's maximize shareholder value in the long term, to a stakeholder organization. A very important part of this is the engaging all the stakeholders as part of this. So that's the point I just gave you an example from the museum area. What the crisis has suggested is the critical importance of the consumers, critical importance of the employees, of the other stakeholder distributors, suppliers engaged in what you're dealing with. This is not a new this trend has been around for a while. Think about the B Corporation that have increased in its popularity and importance over the last few years. Think about the current concern about capitalism and the whole idea of how do you come up with responsible capitalism. Think about the importance of ESG, the environment, sustainability, and governance for responsible investing, and actually the finding that show that company portfolios based on ESG firms is not doing worse than regular portfolios. And think primarily about a major driving force, which is the millennials and the younger generations that are all valuing companies that are having a positive social impact. And they prefer to work for companies that have a positive social impact or changing the world, or buy products and services from such companies. So this switch is inevitable, and I think the current crisis is actually making it even more pronounced. And I think in the US, especially with the post George Floyd incidents, I think you'll see a major uptick in the move towards stakeholder orientation and the rethinking of the values of the corporation to deal with. But it does not mean that shareholder value is not important. It's as important as ever, but it has to be balanced with meeting the objectives and needs of the employees, customers, and other stakeholders involved, and especially that of society. But engaging all the stakeholders who are critical for your survival is absolutely a critical step. We can move to the seventh, please. The seventh guideline is related to the need to enhance your network. Now, every organization has a network of clients, former clients, employees, distributors, suppliers, and others. We did a study published about 2 years ago on it's called the network imperative, where we examined the business models of different companies. And we found out there are 4 business models: asset builders like manufacturers or retailers, service providers like consulting firms, technology creators, software companies, or even pharmaceuticals who create IP, and network orchestrators, companies like Uber, Airbnb, and others who leverage primarily a network and orchestrate the network. And then we asked the question, what is the market value of these companies, the 4 different business models, as a multiple of revenues? And the numbers are in the chart that you can see. The asset builders, it's about 2, the service provider about 3, technology creator was about 5, network orchestrator about 8+. We don't know what the numbers are after the crisis. These are all numbers pre-crisis. My guess is the network orchestrator will become even more critical, even though the 2 prime examples for this, both Google and Airbnb, has been suffering significantly because of the current situation. The question is, for every company, how do you leverage your networks? So every company has networks. How do you leverage them? If you talk about universities, how do you leverage the alumni? How do you leverage the families of the alumni? How do you leverage the executive who participate in executive education courses? How do you leverage the students and so on? So the crisis is actually highlighting the importance, and this is actually implied in some of the discussion that Maura had on the supply chain, in terms of you're really not competing anymore company A versus company B, but you're competing company A and its network, the value chain that they have, versus company B and its network. And it's the strength of the network that is really critical. And if we can turn to the 8th guideline, please. The idea here is, how do you create agility and resilience of your organizations? It's obvious that the crisis suggested that you need to flip from whatever you were doing before to a new reality. Just think about universities in terms of online education, or retailers and others. And to try to do it, what you need is you need to make sure that your organization is agile and resilient, and which implies that you have to work on all the elements of the organizational architecture. The culture and value is absolutely critical, the structure and governance, the processes, the people and competencies. We talked about the talent strategy, the facilities. The facilities will have to go through a fundamental rethinking. How do you address the issue of social distancing? How do you accommodate now the work from home, and what are the implication type of facilities you need? The resources that you have, the technology, and Maura had a list of some of the technologies and how they impact, kind of basically every aspect of business. And very importantly, performance measures and incentives. So how do you assure that you're creating an agile and resilient organizational architecture? And what do you have to do? What are the changes you have to do to any one of these elements to try to assure the agility and resilience of your organization? If you can turn to the next guideline, please. And here we're basically suggesting the need for re-examine the business model and operations, and for increased efficiency, as well as to challenge the revenue model and identify opportunity for profitable growth. So there are 2 aspects here. In time of crisis, cash is king. So the question is, what can you do to try to generate cash? One, obviously, is what many companies have done, is fire people. But it's an opportunity to be more systematic and ask the question, are we really doing the right thing right? What can we do to try to assure that whatever we do is really needed? Most organizations, especially legacy companies, tend to do things that at one time were important, but in today's environment may not be. To what extent I can eliminate them? To what extent I can automate certain activities? To what extent, especially if I'm dealing with a large multi-business unit organizations, can I avoid duplication? There are huge amounts of duplication. in an organization I'm involved with, we did a recent study, it's a financial service company in the technology space. They have a number of business units, and we examined how many of them are focused on developing more innovative approaches to reach the ultimate customer. And we found out there were 7 independent initiatives in the same company doing exactly the same thing, a little different approach in each one of the units. Imagine the amazing saving you can if you can consolidate this. At the same time, examine your revenue models and ask the question, are there new opportunities for profitable growth that I can have at this time? Can I change my revenue models to a different type of model? So I think there is a huge opportunities in kind of taking a more fundamental approach as opposed to just firing people and asking the question, what can I do? Our experience suggests that in legacy companies, if you are focusing on, are we doing the right thing right? You can save about 20% of your budget. But it takes courage and it takes hard work to try to do it. And then in addition to this, you can start looking at how do I generate new revenue models and new approaches. So if you can turn to the 10th and final guideline, which is composed of 2 things. One is the need for continuous innovation and innovation by everyone. You should basically empower your employees and everyone in the organization and in the extended organization, especially if you're using also open innovation, to ask the basic question, is there better ways of doing what I'm doing? You know, kind of in a sense, how can I innovate? How can I come up and improve what I'm doing? What else can I do? And the critical aspect will be to start engaging in experimentation. The only way to learn, to really know what works and doesn't work, is through experimentation. All other methods will give you primarily correlations, but will not give you causal link between what you're doing and the results you're getting. And the temptation in time of crisis is to just do things as opposed to doing them a little more systematically and try to have a control group and try to basically to measure the result of what you're having. And if you are taking, if you have not done it so far, and you are taking a kind of adapting the philosophy of adaptive experimentation, you will have huge benefits. Because if you're doing it, everyone knows that not every experiment will succeed. So you're telling everyone in the organization it is okay to fail. And if we're failing, the question is, what have we learned from the specific failure? And you're creating a culture of innovation. It will also help you attract better talent to the organization who's willing to work for organizations that are more innovative and experimenting. And if you think about all the big players, the big names, the Agfa, the Apple, the Google, the Amazon, the Facebook, all of them are not doing any activity without experimenting. They're running thousands of experiments. It's continuous experimentation of everything they do. So whatever you decide to do based on the 10 guidelines I'm suggesting, whatever else you're doing, try to design it as experiments and learn from this. And the one other item to keep in mind is that during crisis, it's a huge opportunity to learn from natural experiments that are happening out there. So monitor, look for these natural experiments and ask the question, what can I learn from them and how can I apply them in what I'm going to do next? Let me stop here if we can turn to the next page, which lists all 10, and let's open it for questions.
This is for you students, anyone who has any thoughts, comments, questions. So feel free, this is the time. You can either write them in the chat or unmute yourself.
In the meanwhile, I would like to ask, Jerry, how do you reconcile the guideline to strengthen organizational culture with the transformation to digital infrastructure? Like, I kind of see huge barriers here.
I think that digital should be part of the culture. I think I'll go back to the example of museums. Museums historically focused only on their galleries. Curators were primarily rewarded for coming up with wonderful exhibitions in the galleries and coming up with a catalog. What we're trying to do in some places is to change the culture, to say our objective as an organization is to get, let's say, 1 million visitors ideally unique visitors, and millions of engaged visitors online. The curators, we tell them, your responsibility is not to develop a show in the gallery, but at the same time, you have to create an engaging online show or exhibition to attract people globally. And trying to measure the performance, not only how many visitors to the show, but how many visitors are to the online performance, the online exhibition that they're doing. As opposed to just thinking about the traditional catalog, think immediately about how do you create this also as an ebook at the same time. So what you're doing is you have to realize that digital is basically part of our life today. There is no digital and non-digital world. It's an omni-channel world. And what you have to think is basically how do you integrate digital in everything you do? So you have to go back to the organizational architecture that I showed before, and ideally ask each one of the questions, how can you incorporate the new reality? Digital is part of the new reality today, and we cannot go back, and it's not going to change. It's only going to be intensified with some of the advances in AI and some of the other areas. So I think the challenge is to reset it, every aspect of the organizational architecture, including culture, to reflect the new reality of digital.
Thank you.
Oded Kramer, you have a question.
Thank you. My question is that these guidelines seem to me a little risk-taking. You can't follow these guidelines without taking huge risks or significant risks. And it's, in the time of crisis, it's hard to take risks. So how do you see that?
I view that the highest risk of all is not to engage in any of these, because then you're basically stuck. If you go back to the whole concept of what you have to do in time of crisis, survival, capitalize opportunities, and prepare for the next crisis. If you won't do any of these, and you just continue doing what you're doing by cutting costs and trying to kind of just survive there, you will not succeed. Look at the data. The data suggests, kind of hard data about customer engagement. If you do not engage customers during the crisis, including spending money on advertising, smart advertising, relevant advertising, not bullshit advertising, to engage your customer, if you don't engage them effectively, you are not going to do as well as those companies that have done it after the crisis. So you cannot think only in terms of tomorrow morning. You have to think about how do I survive as a company and build a foundation for growth in the future. And unless you'll do one of these 10 things, and definitely do 1 and 10, and then whatever you want to pick in between, I don't think you'll survive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Guys, any other questions before we begin wrapping up? Anyone?
I have a question.
Sure.
I want to know which of the guidelines, hello. I would like to know which of the guidelines is best for small enterprises.
I'm sorry, can you repeat? I could not hear the first part of this. Which of the guidelines?
Are fitting best, or should we give more emphasis when we are trying to help small enterprises?
I think that basically you should examine the appropriateness of any one of these guidelines to any organization, whether small or large, whether in the B2B area or the B2C area or the B2C to B area. They can apply to any organization. You really have to examine what's your organization. I would suggest that every organization should start with idealized design. So who do you want to be? What do you want to be? What is your legacy? What are you trying to accomplish here? And once you know what it is, and once you know your strengths and weaknesses, and once you look at the markets you're serving and what are you trying to accomplish here, then say, which of these can I apply in this area? I would say that engaging your stakeholder, especially engaging your customers, engaging your employees, is absolutely a must. You will not be able to survive without it. if you're not engaging your customers, if you not engage your employees, the critical employees you're keeping, and you would like to be the foundation of the business, you will not be able to survive. And small organization is even more of a challenge, and the needs, going back to the previous question about risk, the small organization have to take even more of a risk to try to undertake some of these things, because if they don't have the resources to survive, if they're not going to try to experiment and do some of these things. So I see these as different areas that every company should examine, ask the question, how does it fit what I want to do? How does it fit my current unique situation, my competitive environment, the markets in which I'm at, and the like, and try to do it. My experience with companies that we discussed these 10 guidelines with and are using it has been quite amazing. In a recent session I had with a group in a technology company, we had 45 of their senior executive in a session. They were given the assignment, which I mentioned before. You have 3 weeks to identify one of them and start experiment with them and do something. They came back 3 weeks later reporting. They reported on 60 different initiatives they took. Now, will all 60 work? Probably not, but if few of them will work, this company is going to be by far better off than without trying to engage and experiment and create experiments around these areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliana, also for your questions. Kovi, you have a question? Kovi?
He must be on mute.
Hello? Give me a second. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I was just touching on the talent strategy and open innovation. It sounds really amazing, but I can kind of understand maybe some technology companies, especially when their core offering is around the technology, not wanting to go outside of the business. What do you see as the biggest challenges standing in the way of really moving to that like open digital talent strategy?
First of all, keep in mind that open innovation applies in all domains, not only technology. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a company established, Victor and Spoils, in the advertising area that recruited over 7,000 creative people from all over the world. And when a company had an advertising assignment, what they did is they gave it to them, they sent it to their people. So Harley Davidson, for example, was one of their big users. And the campaign that you may have seen, which is We Are Free, not in cages, I'm sorry, the campaign was not in cages, which showed that wherever you are, whatever you do, you're in a house, in a car, you're always in a cage. The only time when you're not in a cage is when you're on a Harley. This campaign was developed through open innovation with this company, Victor and Spoils. There are other companies in the domain of consulting. There's a company in New York called Shout that primarily have over 3,000 consultants. They're doing it. So open innovation is in all domains. It's not only, and especially open talent is becoming now in all domains, not only in the technology area. The major obstacle for this is fear of loss of control. So it's really a mindset, going back to the mental model. And the mental model is historically, I have to control my people. I could have been better controlled than if I'm doing it internally. But realize the reality is that you don't have the best people in the world to solve your problem. Your problem may have been solved already 7 times in different domains and by others, and only by open innovation you can find out about this. Actually, there are some studies that are showing that significant number of the new problems that are being presented by major companies are problems that existed and were solved before, and by going open innovation, you're getting the people to present it to you. So you're concerned typically about kind of losing control. You're concerned about loss of intellectual property, but this can be solved. What you can do is the people can sign a non-disclosure. You can take a big project you have, divide it into small components. Every competition is only on a component that does not really reveal the whole thing. You maintain only the integration of all the parts together. If you think about Boeing, was using not necessarily open innovation, but using an outsourcing strategy like this, for any one of their airplanes, they use like 7,000 suppliers for different parts. They manufacture internally only the wings and the integration. Everything else is being done outside. So by smart design, you can really overcome this. So identify what are the obstacles to this and try then to realize the benefit of open innovation is enormous. If you think about the 4x and 8x improvement in cost and speed is unbelievable. In addition to this, you're getting by far better talent than the one that you can just recruit. So my view is every organization should really think about their talent strategy and change it and start experimenting with open innovation. And if you don't believe me, go to on the NASA website, go on a number of all major companies are now engaged in open innovation.
Okay, thank you very much. Unless there's another question, I think we can close, Jerry.
This will be great. So if you can turn to my last page, will be great. So in closing, my suggestion would be for you to select one area of opportunity and design an experiment around it. Ideally, if you're in a class and if you had time, even though this is the last class, I would, would have been great if you could report back to the group. But continue basically doing what you're doing, but try to augment it with a thought and with an idea of moving toward identifying and creating new opportunities. You cannot just continue staying where you are. You remember this example of the museum that thought they can separate survival from service. You cannot. The service to key stakeholder is a key component that will allow your survival. So keep safe, healthy, and enjoy primarily designing your own future. Thank you.
You're not. I would like to say a word.
Yes, sure. We have with us Professor Peckelman, or Dean.
Jerry, I just want to thank you for what I would call a life-changing lecture. Thank you for taking the effort.
Thank you. I hope that you'll take it seriously, guys, and try to implement some of the ideas. And all the best.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Wynn, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and we appreciate so much you coming to visit us in Israel in such a short notice. And we will now wrap up for 5 minutes or a course, so please, you feel welcome to stay with us and to have a brief zooming into what we did until now. So guys, I'm sharing now my screen again so we can discuss a quick wrap up and looking forward towards the future. So we began 6 sessions ago, which is actually 7-8 weeks ago, in the I think really the top of the COVID crisis in Israel. The world is now investing resources to overcome this outbreak and to understand its medical and economic effects. And we already know, and we feel so much, that this crisis has enormous implications on our lives. And we here at the IDC, the Harrison School, has decided to use this crisis as a learning opportunity. And we wanted to share academic expertise in various disciplines for making managerial decisions and dealing with this crisis and crisis in general. So what did we have? I'll just quickly go over the lectures that we had. So we had Dr. Shiran talking about leadership in times of crisis. We had Professor Goldenberg, who interviewed Professor Luzon, and they talked about managerial decisions and their impact on how we interrupt the COVID. We had Professor Arieli talked about how to change behavior both in standard times and Corona times. And we had Professor Trachtenberg talking about the reactions of the financial markets to this COVID-19. We then had Professor Abramov talking about the coronavirus impact and on globalization and economic growth, and a more psychological point of view, Dr. Pereg talking about work environment and crisis. Then we began our second half. The fourth session was Dr. Hochman talking about behavioral ethics in these times of crisis, and Professor Lieberman, who interviewed Professor Ashkenazi from Sheba, They were talking about decision-making under uncertainty. We then had a more marketing-focused discipline, Professor Libai, talking about how new product growth is so similar to how the COVID epidemic looks in terms of graphs and spread. And we had Professor Goldenberg talking about being systematically creative in these times of crisis. And then finally today we had our two distinguished guests from Wharton, Professor Mauro who talked about, Gillen who talked about economic and business impact of the COVID, and Professor Wynn talking about opportunities in times of crisis and giving us some guidelines and hope towards the future looking forward. So I want to, of course, I have to end with a thank you note, a huge thank you note to all of the many people who assisted us in launching this course so quickly, the administration and the lecturers who all hopped on this course and helped us, and of course the support of our dean. And I want to thank Professor Khashai who agreed to join this journey, and to thank our dedicated TA Oded. And of course, we all want to thank you guys, our students, because nothing of this would have worked and would have worked well without you, and without you being so engaged and enthusiastic about it. And most final note, we want to also announce now part B. So we are these days working extensively in developing the second part of this course, Managing Business in a Time of Crisis, which will focus on case studies. So we are aiming that their second part of this course will open in a while and focus on case studies. This is in cooperation with what's called GCMO, Global CMOs. It's a forum of Israelis' top CMOs from global companies, and helping to develop it, or Professor Khashai and also Dr. Talia Rimon, who's also on this Zoom today, and Shirley Brodetsky. And this course is about to focus on how CMOs, which is Chief Marketing Officers from global firms, are coping these days with the crisis that we are now all experiencing. So please all stay tuned for further details, and we hope you'll be interested in joining that course as well. And we will now also share with you, Oded, if you can send in the chat a link for a quick feedback. So if you can all take, it's a 1-minute feedback that we would love to hear from you, how satisfied you were or you weren't, and what were the good aspects and the aspects that we should improve for next time. So on this note, I want to thank you all. I see you all now in these squares. And Niron, do you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say that we all should really thank Yonat for being the entrepreneur of this great course, and it wouldn't have happened without Yonat, and it has been a pleasure to work with you on that.
Same here. Okay, so thank you guys, and please give us your feedback on the link that Oded just sent. And so thank you guys, have a Shabbat Shalom. And we'll miss our Friday meetings with you, but we'll see you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the course. It was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.